And I remember at the end of the first term, a reporter said to the president, how would you mark the way your White House was running when you first took office compared to now at the end of the first term? And he said, well, at the beginning, I had the best players on the field. And at the end of the first term, I had the best team. And to me, the difference is trust.
Welcome to Nonprofits Now, Leading Today, a new podcast that gives nonprofit leaders a playbook to tackle today's most pressing leadership challenges. Valerie Jarrett, I am so excited to talk to you about how to build a wonderful team. Nothing is more important than that, than being surrounded by people who do great work. And I know you have a lot of expertise in this.
Hello, Stacy. I am delighted to be here. Thank you for having me.
Over the course of your career, you've had so many opportunities to build teams. And I'm curious, what are some of the most important ingredients as you think about assembling a strong team?
Well, you are only as good as your weakest link. And so making sure that every single member of your team not only shares your values and understands the mission, but also the kind of culture you're trying to create. They're going to be the agents for change, and that you actually know their stories. And so in the interview process, I always like to take the time to ask questions about, where are you from? Where did you grow up? How did you get to where you are? As a way of really seeing if there's chemistry in addition to everything else. And so I think there's just nothing more important than spending the time on the front end, because it's much harder on the back end.
Absolutely. What are some of the warning signs, even in those early interviews you often have, that maybe say this might not be a fit?
People who aren't forthcoming, who aren't willing to be vulnerable and tell you not just all of their strengths, but what some of the challenges along life's pathway have been. I always ask that question, and people who, tell you the biggest challenge is how to deal with all their talent. Well, okay, that's not right. That's not the answer that you're looking for. And so I do think that it is a sign of strength if you're willing to be vulnerable, admit where you've made mistakes, demonstrate the learning curve, and not shy away from questions. I'm always interested in the full story, but if I ask a question, I really want at some point for you to answer the question that I asked.
Even though you come from the political realm where people are trained not to answer questions.
Exactly.
I would imagine you're good at catching that.
Well, the very first prep I remember having before doing a press interview, the person who was prepping me said, you don't have to answer the question that you're asked. You can just answer the question you want to answer. And that never really rang true for me. I always thought people deserve an answer.
Absolutely. I'm curious, as you were building the team for the Obama Foundation, what were some of the kinds of things that you were looking for? What did you need in your executive team?
Well, I needed conviction and commitment to the mission. I needed people who had some experience in the world, not just all in government or all in the private sector, but I'm partial to people who've had circuitous roots similar to my own. I look for people whose backgrounds were not identical to my own, because I think you make better decisions if you're surrounded by, the rich diversity that is available. I looked for people who would be willing to push back at me if they disagreed, but also be willing to go along with the decision once it's made. And that's a delicate balance. If they're going to agree with everything I have to say, well, then they're taking up space. But on the other hand, once a decision is made, you want people who are willing to say, okay, I'm going to go along with the decision. And I, in turn, have always tell people that I'm going to be as transparent in the decision-making process as possible and as inclusive in the decision-making process as possible, so that at the end of the process, people feel as though their voices were heard. And so I look for people who are willing to be contrarian, and even people who might agree, but will say, well, let me present the other viewpoint just to make sure that the collective wisdom has the benefit of an opposite viewpoint. I look for people who have a sense of humor. A lot of the challenges that we face are really tough, and many of the leaders with whom we work are extraordinarily challenged. Right now in particular, but always their work has been hard. And so I really look for kind of that EQ ability of being able to recognize when people need a little extra care and tending to, and really share the values that we're trying to instill in our leaders. We have to lead by example. And so going through that interview process, always, if I can, I try to have a meal with people. You just get them so that they'll let their hair down and really tell you who they are. And I think the Obama Foundation, the possibilities are endless for us. And so I want people who think big, but recognize that we're really still in the early stages. And that means we have to pace ourselves. And so making sure that there's that mind meld at the front end, I think is very important for them and also for the foundation.
Absolutely. And I think that idea of trying to share a meal if possible, you really learn a lot about people and their personality and whether you're going to enjoy working with them. And they have that flexibility. That's excellent advice.
The issues we deal with are very serious, but I don't want people who take themselves so seriously.
Right.
And I guess the other point, Stacy, I would make, and this is hard to really suss out sometimes, particularly in the first interview, is we're a part of something bigger and much more important than ourselves. And so I don't want them coming in thinking, well, when do I get my first promotion? When do I get my first pay raise? How many people are going to be on my team? This is a we place. And so I want people to really be able to demonstrate to me that they get that and that they buy in. And that means that some years they might have to sacrifice a little bit for the greater good. And there are other years where their priorities are going to be our priorities, and then they're going to be the beneficiaries. And I want to make sure that their colleagues feel seen and appreciated when they're the ones that are getting, the largest part of the resources that we have.
What you just said about that measure, is that something that's special in nonprofit leadership?
Look, the revenue that we're going to be able to generate on the campus itself is going to be relatively small. So we're dependent upon fundraising. And look, fundraising, some years it's really, really amazing. There are other years, due to circumstances beyond our control, where it might not be so easy. And I have served on a bunch of not-for-profit boards, and I've always thought that we should bring our heart as well as our business acumen to the not-for-profit arena. So yes, our missions are noble, but we have to live within our means. And we're spending other people's money. And so we have to be very careful and judicious in how we're doing it. And we can't just assume, well, if we spend it, then there's more to come. And we have to be spending our money in a way which is going to have a track record of impact. I think that's another responsibility that we have. Donors want to give money where they see success. And we are so fortunate that we have so many success stories through our leaders and this incredible campus that's going to be opening next year on the south side of Chicago. And you can't take those resources for granted. You really have to show appreciation to those who have been so generous. And that is different in, I think, the not-for-profit world than it is in some of the for-profit. For-profit, yes, you're accountable to your shareholders, but you have the opportunity to generate revenue, and that's really the backbone of your success. And that's not the case oftentimes with not-for-profits.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And making sure that the executive team is thinking about that all the time, about that responsibility to the donors.
Exactly. And thinking of creative and fun ways of showing our appreciation to our donors as well.
Absolutely. So once you've assembled this team and you've had these wonderful lunches and breakfasts and other kinds of things to recruit great people, what do you do to make sure that the team itself gels?
Well, you know what? It's a good, timely question. We just had a retreat of our senior team. And we always start with a meal the night before. Last year, I invited everybody over to my home. We still had some new members of the team. And I prefer a home to a restaurant. And so we had everybody over there and we relaxed and had a few drinks and let our hair down. And the dinner was really not about work. And then another one of our retreats, we went to a restaurant and we invited someone who runs another not-for-profit institution in Chicago to come and have dinner with us. Again, not thinking about work, but just picking her brain and seeing, how we could be a better colleague to her as well. So we're building this broad network of not-for-profits within our community. And this year, the University of Chicago was kind enough to give us a tutorial on leadership right before our dinner. And then we had a fun dinner as well. And then we spent the day really thinking through strategically, what do we want to do over the next 3 to 5 years? And to make sure that our mission was aligned. And it's interesting, some of our programs have been going on a while now. So we also regularly, of course, meet with President Obama. It's his name that's on the door. And he gave us some really good feedback. He said, now that we've been up and running for a while, take a step back and let's really look at what's working. And let's be honest about what's not working. Let's look at the environment in which we're in right now. And are we meeting the demands of this climate the same way we were, say, 10 years ago. And it was so liberating to have him say, just be fresh and clear in your thinking. And just because we've done it this way doesn't mean we always have to. In fact, institutions that really sustain and replenish themselves are ones that are willing to be courageous enough to look beyond what we already do.
And what an excellent idea to say, let's look at it fresh. I know I get super frustrated when people say, well, we've always done it that way. And
you hear that so often.
It's rarely the right answer.
It is really rarely the right answer. And even if we've always done it that way, it doesn't mean we always should going forward.
A lot of the things you often emphasize are making sure that people have a chance to meet in person, have a meal, do those things. What do you do remotely to sort of build in some way of getting that same personal touch?
Yeah, so we have an all-staff meeting once a month, and I come on. We have an agenda for the meeting. We're presenting parts of the foundation that everybody might not be familiar with. So we'll have a presentation on the Presidential Center and how we're doing on construction with these incredible photographs. And they hear directly from the team. I rarely present at these meetings because I want them to get to know each other as well as getting to know me. I also will have town halls where there really is little of any presentation coming forth. It's really a chance for people to have a chance to ask me questions. I always let them send me questions ahead of time. I used to be painfully shy when I was younger, and I would never have asked a question in front of a couple hundred people. And so giving people a chance to submit a question either anonymously or with their name attached so they don't have to, get up and perform in a sense, is another way. And then I'll have mini town halls with smaller groups. And then I also, when people onboard, and I think this is important, once every 2 weeks to 4 weeks, when we have 3 or 4 or 5, 6 new people, I have a session with them, at least a half an hour, hopefully an hour, and no agenda. We go around, we introduce ourselves. And again, it's a chance for me to get to know them and them to get to know me and them to get to know each other. And I tell them, I always say, tell me something that's not on your resume. And oh my goodness, Stacey, you wouldn't believe the things that I've learned about folks, but it gives you a different dimension on them as a whole person. And I think that's really helpful. And then of course I meet with my teams, the whole team, not just the senior team, periodically as well. And I encourage the senior team to encourage the more junior staff to do the presentation so that they get the practice of doing that. And the same thing with our board meetings. We try to get people in front of the board so that they feel, number one, that same pressure that I feel day in and day out coming from the board, but also so the board can see what an incredible bench of talent we do have.
Boards absolutely love that too, when they get to meet all of the wonderful people. I found that really transformative. The board doesn't just want to hear from me. And
well,
the more
exactly.
You can get other people
and
out.
We spend a lot of time with our board before every board meeting. And I suggest this to every not-for-profit. We meet with the committee chair. We go over the agenda. We meet with the full board individually if they're available to go over everything that will be coming before the board and all of the committees. We make sure there is an agreement about what the agenda should be with the chairs and with the board chair for the executive committee. So that by the time we get to the board meeting itself, hopefully things are going to go very smoothly. And then throughout that entire process, I try to include everybody on the team who's worked on a matter, again, so that the board gets to see them in a less formal setting than an actual board presentation.
It's a great way of working. I know that sometimes you've had challenges with groups, and there's one time that got a lot of attention in Washington where I live, and so I was following this closely, where you pulled together a group of women who were working in the White House who were feeling that they weren't necessarily as heard as they should be. And I'm wondering if you can explain how you empowered them to be able to be sure that they truly were making a difference.
Well, it's a good point, and this applies to every organization. Your culture is something that you really have to work at. And just because you have this view of a culture that you want to have doesn't make it so. And early on, when President Obama was in office, you'll remember we were in the middle of this terrible economic crisis. Millions of people were losing their jobs and their homes. The banks were on the verge of collapse. Our automobile industry, also many of them in bankruptcy. And we had a healthcare crisis, 2 wars. Suffice to say, there was a lot going on. And half of the department heads in the White House were women. And I was very proud, having co-chaired his transition, that we were able to recruit so many superstar women who had amazing subject matter expertise. What they didn't have, though, was a relationship with the rest of the team and the president. And several of the senior men had pre-existing relationships with the president. They'd worked on the campaign, or they knew him from his time in the Senate. And so here you are pushing together this bigger group, some who knew the president, some who didn't. And I was the only senior woman, really, who had this pre-existing close relationship with the president. And what I began to notice, Stacy, a couple months in, is that the women's voices were shrinking. Not when they're with the president, because everybody was on their best behavior when he was around, but when we were in our senior staff meetings. And women have all experienced, you say something and nobody really pays attention. A couple of minutes later, a guy says the exact same thing and suddenly it's brilliant. And voices were raised, and women, when voices start to get high, women tend to get quieter and shrink a bit. And one woman came to me and she said she was thinking of resigning. Maybe this is 6 months in by this point. And I thought, oh my gosh, you're critical. You can't resign. So I went to the president and I said, I'm beginning to pick up the sense that women don't feel as though their voices are being heard. And he said, well, that's ridiculous. In my White House, my goodness, I was raised by a single mom. My grandmother worked. My wife is this extraordinarily successful lawyer and executive. I have 2 daughters. How could I not have the kind of culture that would embrace all of the incredible talent we have? And I said, well, it is what it is. So he said, well, look, we're going to gather up the women and have dinner. We're going to talk about it. And so in preparation for that dinner, I went to all of the women and I said, the president wants to hear from you. You cannot go to the dinner and say, oh, Mr. President, everything is fine, which is what you will be tempted to do, because none of you want this to be taking up his precious time, but it's important. And I said, and also, if you do that, I'm going to look ridiculous, because I've told him there's a problem. I don't want to look ridiculous. And all of them spoke up and he listened. I remember he took off his suit jacket and he rolled up his sleeves and he acted like this was the most important thing going on. And it got to the point where the women started looking at their watches going, oh my gosh, we've been here almost 3 hours. And at the end, after having listened, which is a mark of a good leader, is you listen first, he said, look, this is the White House. I am dealing with issues that affect literally billions of people here and around the world. And you are here because I handpicked you, because you have this incredible expertise. If you're not speaking up, I won't make as good of a decision. And I need you to fight, not for yourself. This shouldn't be about you. This should be about me and my presidency and how you're going to help me be a better president. What an empowering thing to say. And then he said, look, I'm going to go back and talk to the guys, but if you don't think things are getting better, tell Valerie and we're going to come at this again. And this is really important, Stacy. Not only did he empower all of us to feel like we could use our voices, but he gave me the idea of, well, how about if we just have dinner without him, without the guys, and just the women? And so what happened? We got to know each other and know our stories and become friends. And if you walk into a meeting, whether you are in the private, public, or not-for-profit sector, and you're a little nervous and you're wondering if you should say something, and you make eye contact with somebody who you just had dinner with the night before, and they're nodding at me the way you're nodding at me, Stacy, it just makes you feel stronger and more courageous. And so that's what happened. And the women started speaking up, and the guys had been no doubt chastised. And so they started listening a little bit better. And I remember at the end of the first term, a reporter said to the president, how would you mark the way your White House was running when you first took office compared to now at the end of the first term? And he said, well, at the beginning, I had the best players on the field. And at the end of the first term, I had the best team. And to me, the difference is trust. And trust comes when you actually know somebody. You just don't know like how smart they are or what kind of ideas they have, but like what's going on in their life. Do they have a sick parent? Are they having a new baby? Are they worried about this or that? Are they excited about this or that? And when you get comfortable enough to start sharing who you really are, whether it's in your first interview, which I encourage, or whether it's at the end of 4 years, that's when things gel.
I love that idea of thinking about it as trust and the fact that first you had the players and then you had the team. I think that's a great measure for all leaders to be thinking about. You mentioned the extraordinary challenges that you had when you came into the White House. I'm wondering, are there one or two examples of how you pulled your team together to get something done that you think are really instructive of what great leadership is in a time of crisis, given that we're all facing a lot of challenges today?
Yes, so there are a few things. First of all, you do have to have clarity of the long view. What is it? And in the case of the White House, what was on the president's agenda for the first term? What did he want to get done? What was most important to him? And he was very clear with us about what that was. And so I said, keep that on your wall front and center, because my office is in particular, the Office of Public Engagement and the Office of Intergovernmental Affairs. We had a lot of incoming. Governors who had a hurricane, individuals who cared about immigration reform. We had people who were on opposite sides of the same issue, because we cast our net broadly to make sure that we were going to be informed by the people who were most directly impacted by the decisions that the president made. And so my office always had people coming in who had different viewpoints. And so I said, just remember the direction we're going. And that means along that path, you're going to take a lot of incoming fire. And so resilience is really important as well. And I said, and center yourself, spend some part of the day where you're really reminding yourself why you're here and what we're trying to accomplish, so that the incoming doesn't hurt so much, because it's painful. It's really quite painful when you get a lot of it. And so that you don't get distracted. And I'll give you a funny example. Part of my responsibility, of course, is to know what the press is saying. And so, get a lot of incoming, and our press secretary would brief us in the morning, and I would watch cable news and get a sense of, what's the chatter in DC, you'll appreciate. And anytime I walked in the Oval Office and I had that like deer in the headlights look on my face, President Obama would say to me, have you been watching cable news? And he'd say, go and talk to some real people. And that will remind you that what is at stake for them is far more than, what the chattering class is saying about us on any given day. And I think that's a big piece of getting through it. And it enables you to ignore the noise, Stacy, because noise is a distraction. And it's, you got to temper it, because some of the noise is constructive criticism, and that you've got to let in. And you got to really hear it to make sure that we're making informed decisions and we're balancing a whole bunch of competing interests. But then you got to learn to tune out stuff that is just not constructive. And that's something else that I encourage my team. And I also said to my team, look, if you see another member of the team struggling, help them out. And I remember one time, the day that Congress repealed Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which was the law that prevented openly gay people from serving in the military. The day that passed, which is a huge victory and a big part of President Obama's first term agenda, the exact same day, the DREAM Act, which would have allowed children who were brought to this country by their parents but weren't citizens, it would have allowed them to stay in this country. It failed. And I had teams working on both. And they were both in the office of Cecilia Munoz, who oversaw these two parts of my team, all in tears of joy, tears of sorrow. And I remember I went down to the president and I said, oh my gosh, you should see what's going on upstairs. And he came upstairs and he gave this speech about, for those of you who are celebrating, or remember that there are those of you who are really crushed. And for those of you who are crushed, the path to celebration is long and hard, but you'll get there too. And it was such a poignant and meaningful way of recognizing that this is what we're trying to do. And it's all hard. And sometimes you're there for the thunderbolt. And sometimes you're just laying the foundation for the thunderbolt to come, weeks, months, years, decades later.
Oh, that's really a great example of what to do. And to remember that each person on the team is going through sometimes very, very different experiences, even though you are working toward the same goal. Because I think sometimes in the rush, we all lose sight of some of that.
And people won't always ask for help. And I think one of the things that I really appreciated about my team, and when I had a superstar team, is that they could look at somebody's face and tell they needed help. And that continues to this day. We just recently learned that someone on our team has cancer. And the group that rallied around her was incredible, many of whom she probably hadn't seen in years, but yet they showed up for her.
And you probably have people sometimes coming in and out of the leadership team because people get other opportunities. What does that do to the chemistry once you've built this really strong team? How do you deal with that?
I think it's harder in a not-for-profit setting. And perhaps it's because you share these, noble mission and values. Perhaps it's because people who are drawn to the not-for-profit world tend to have, a better sense of each other, and they take that time to get to know one another. And it can be really painful to have a member of the team either leave or become ill. And so being honest about the difficulty and the challenge is the first step. Figuring out collectively, how are we going to not replace, but fill that void, because you can't necessarily find somebody with the exact same skill set. Being open to new people coming in. And again, talking about the fact that we have to realize that in order for new people to feel welcome, it can't just be this closed team that's been working together well. We encountered a bit of this, honestly, with people who had worked in the White House with President Obama and those who had not. It was kind of like the White House group and everybody else. They weren't in on the jokes, et cetera. To this day, have to remind ourselves that, look, we had this extraordinary experience, but everybody didn't have that experience. So be generous of spirit to those who didn't. Don't tell inside jokes. Make people feel welcome, include them in the story so that they feel ownership of those stories too. Because as we create this foundation and the Presidential Museum, it's going to be full of stories. And all of us are going to be ambassadors for those stories. So we have to take the time to share those stories with the entire team.
Absolutely. One of the things we've done to better understand what the life of a nonprofit CEO is like is we've asked them a series of questions about what they love about their jobs, what they find most challenging. And most of them absolutely love and adore what they're doing because they're so passionate about their missions, but they feel tremendous pressure. And part of that pressure is there's just not enough time to get to all of the things that are crucial to get done. Do you have some advice on what good leaders can do to help their teams manage their time?
Delegate every single thing that can be delegated. If somebody else can do it, you don't need to do it. And try to not think you have to do it all yourself. Again, particularly small enterprises where, everybody's like chief cook and bottle washer. For the person who's running the organization, you really do need to delegate. Doesn't mean you don't supervise, but you do need to delegate. And so try to get off your plate everything that somebody else can do. Make sure that everything on your plate is there for a reason, not just because somebody asked for a meeting, but what is this meeting going to achieve for you, for the enterprise? How's it going to move the ball forward? How are you making an impact? And try to figure out how you measure your impact with not just your team, but you personally. And my team, for example, has been devising a tool that will let me see how I'm spending my time. It's fascinating to see. And once you know how you're spending your time, you might get surprised and you might want to make some adjustments to ensure your time being spent is aligned with your priorities. And so measure what you can, figure out how you're having an impact, and also open up the feedback loop. We just finished our round of reviews with my senior team. I always say to my team, what can I do better? Tell me how I can be a more effective leader. What can I do to make your job easier? People will often have a very good idea of what you could do, but they won't tell you unless you give them the permission to do so.
Absolutely. I have found people are surprised when I say, what can I do for you? Like, oh my goodness, yes, you're asking me that question. And I think, well, that's my job, is to help you do better.
Exactly.
But you really do have to open up that conversation in various ways. One of the things you talked about earlier in the conversation is how you get ideas through town halls and, getting people to submit questions in advance if they don't feel like asking them in person because they might be intimidated. Can you talk about other steps you do to make sure that everybody has a chance to contribute and that, there's a real spirit that anybody can contribute, that while you have this great executive team, that they're not the only ones who are making decisions, yes, and having the great ideas?
Well, I'm very intentional about trying to lift up when somebody comes to me with a great idea and they are a more junior staff person. So we have somebody who's more senior now, but he was very junior at the time, who came up with the idea. And I have a suggestion box, which is available 24/7. Anybody can send me an idea, not just when we have town halls. His idea was to have donors name spaces after someone upon whose shoulders they stand at the Obama Center. So, normally at large institutions, donors will have their own name, on a lobby or a classroom or whatever. And so we decided, in the spirit of President Obama, who believes we all stand on the shoulders of others, the first part of his museum will be devoted to those upon whose shoulders we stand. What a wonderful idea.
But to be sure, what happens when you make sure that everybody has a chance to contribute ideas all the time? Sometimes people will think that they are running the organization, and that can be a challenge for a leader too. How do you send a message that's supportive but says, wait a minute, you're not the one running this organization. One day you will be, but you're not now.
Well, Stacy, it's funny you'd ask that question because that's exactly what happened several months ago. I was meeting with the whole team, and someone who was very junior said, well, I don't know why you don't have somebody on the executive leadership team who's junior. And I said, because they're not a senior executive. And that takes time and that takes experience. And I'm here today to listen to all of your ideas, and your boss and your boss's boss and your boss's boss's boss. They're all here to listen to your ideas too. But the actual decision making has to come from people who are seasoned and who have judgment and experience. And that just comes with time. And you're not quite there yet. One day you will be. And I am a person that does believe in really direct feedback. I don't believe that you should, sugarcoat or lead people to believe something that's not true. I think part of the learning process is to get that feedback. And so there was no admonishment for having had that idea at all. It was a perfectly reasonable thing to ask, but the ultimate decision-making still rests with the senior team. I am as explicit about the values that I have as possible, and the president's and Mrs. Obama's vision and what we're trying to accomplish and how we're trying to accomplish it. If you don't think you fit in here, then that's okay. And I'll try to help you find a place where you do fit in, because I want people to land well. And I think people appreciate clarity.
Speaking of President Obama, I'm curious, as you worked with him and got to know him for such a long time, are there special leadership lessons that you got from him that you'd like to share with all of us?
He has that insatiable appetite of curiosity. And I think that's a real strength. He's a good and active listener, which comes from actually caring about what people have to say. We've all been in situations where people have asked us a question, and then you can tell they're not really listening to the answer. And he was always looking beyond the senior person to the bench and going, well, what do you think? I know you did all the work, and making a joke about it to get the person comfortable. And I think part of the responsibility of leadership is an understanding that the playing field is very uneven. And it's up to you to level it so that people feel comfortable. Just by sheer virtue of his title, President of the United States, that's intimidating. And so you have to just get people comfortable. And he would do it with humor. He would do it with body language. He would do it with his tone of voice. And all of that, I think, enabled him to get the best out of the folks who were around them and to make people feel a part of what he was trying to accomplish. But he also didn't believe in conversation just for conversation's sake. A good debate is interesting, but then let's make a decision. And I always felt that his time was precious, and therefore it was up to us as the senior leaders to tee things up for him, hopefully with the best due diligence so that he could make a decision. He would never tell you at the beginning of the meeting what he thought, because again, that had a chilling impact. And because people felt a part of that process, then when he made a decision, they were much more likely to say, okay, great. And we're all in the same boat and let's go forth.
In these incredibly tumultuous times when leaders are dealing with all kinds of government policy shifts, an economy that really does not seem like things are going to go well, it's threatening the mission of many nonprofit organizations. So this is a tough time to be a leader. What do you advise them to think most about?
Yeah, I just met with our scholars from the University of Chicago, and their level of anxiety was pretty high. And I said, look, part of taking the long view is figuring out what do you need to do to replenish yourself. You got to be strong first. And so don't work 24/7 and think you can keep it up, because it is a marathon. It is not a sprint. Who's in your life that can bring you joy at a time when you're feeling all of this incredible anxiety, and make room for them and be present and engaged with them? I have 2 grandchildren who, no matter what I've been thinking about in the course of the day, after 10 minutes with them, it's cleared my mind and I'm laughing hysterically. And then I have to get back to work. But that time that I was with them is really part of the replenishment process. And also to figure out how you can share how you're feeling and what you're doing with other people who are similarly situated. You might be sharing best practices and learn how to do more with less. And we all just have to get more creative. You have to think of new and interesting ways of raising money. We have to figure out new ways of collaborating to solve problems. So this is a time for great collaboration and measuring impact and recognizing that, the future depends on what we do. You can't sit around expecting somebody else to solve these big challenges. We all have a responsibility to do it. I said this to our young people. I said, figure out in your own community where you can have an impact. And there are lots of things that are going on about which you have no control and they are causing stress. But there are also things that you have a great deal of control about. Are you kind to a stranger in the grocery store? Are you helping volunteer in your community, even though you're running a not-for-profit? Are you doing just that little bit extra that not only is helping the person that you're directing that kindness to, but it also just makes you feel better? And I think we all have to take this deep breath and do those kind of unsolicited acts of kindness to go beyond our day job. And that's what makes me feel better.
Our standing last question is about what we just talked about. How do you recharge? You mentioned a couple of things, but given all of the things that you have had on your plate throughout your career, I'm curious, are there some things that are your go-tos for how you recharge in a period of anxiety?
Well, for me, family is everything. And I'm fortunate to spend a good part of my time in New York. My daughter and my son-in-law and my grandchildren live here. And when I'm in New York, I try to spend every moment possible with them. I have a lot of family in Chicago, which is where the presidential center is going to be located. And for decades now, we've had Sunday dinner together. And so spending Sundays with my family and people who knew me back in the day. And so they're not in the least bit, intimidated by title or what I'm doing with my life. It's just Valerie, or Lally was my nickname. And, an evening with them makes me replenish. And, whether it's that or a good book or looking at crazy TV shows that I would be too embarrassed to tell you what I watch, all of that enables me to recharge. There's just no substitute for surrounding yourself and recognizing that there is that need. We are human beings. We have to have people in our life. That takes effort to be present and engaged in the lives of people that you love. But when you do that, it is also an act of selfishness because it will replenish you.
Absolutely. Wonderful advice. Thank you for a conversation full of insights and advice that all of us can put to use right away. I know I learned so much from you, and I want to thank you for an amazing career dedicated to public service. You've inspired us all. Thanks for a wonderful conversation.
I appreciate that. I enjoyed being with you, Stacy.